The kitchen at Hargrove had broken 3 executive chefs and 1 food critic's spirit in the same calendar year, and on the Thursday night that mattered most, it had finally broken down entirely. Not the staff, not the service, the oven system itself, a custom-built 12-unit convection array that a Belgian engineering firm had designed specifically for the restaurant's open kitchen concept, and which had, according to the firm's lead consultant, a failure rate of less than 1% across all installations worldwide. The consultant had said this with the particular confidence of a man who has never personally witnessed the 1%. The head of operations at Hargrove, a woman named Sylvia Cheng, who had run the Pho-H at 3 Michelin-starred establishments before the age of 40 and who did not believe in catastrophizing, had used the word catastrophic twice in the same phone call. The Saturday gala was 36 hours away. The kitchen was cold. And then, just after 10 o'clock on a Thursday evening, a man in a canvas jacket with a tear at the left shoulder walked through the service entrance at the back of the building. He was carrying a canvas tool bag that had seen better decades and a steel thermos that hadn't been washed thoroughly enough. His 12-year-old daughter walked 2 steps behind him, her backpack over both shoulders, a battered library book tucked under one arm, her reading glasses slightly crooked on her face. The man set the bag down on the stainless steel prep counter, looked at the oven bank for a long moment without touching anything, and said, quietly and without ceremony, "I've seen this before." His name was Leonard Beaumont, and almost nobody in that kitchen knew anything about him beyond the fact that he had a small appliance repair business on the west side of the city that operated out of a converted garage and smelled permanently of solder and machine oil. What they did not know was what Sylvia Cheng had spent most of Thursday afternoon finding out. The repair shop was called Beaumont and Daughter, which was technically inaccurate because the daughter, Ren, was 12 years old and still had 3 years of middle school ahead of her. But she had been coming to the shop after school since she was 8, sitting on a stool in the corner doing homework with a precision that Leonard had always recognized as belonging entirely to her mother. The stool had a cushion on it that Ren had sewn herself from a piece of upholstery fabric she found at the end of someone's driveway on recycling day. She had sewn it with the same unhurried concentration she applied to everything she attempted, and she had sewn it well, because Ren Beaumont did not do things approximately. Leonard was 44 years old and looked exactly as old as he was, in the particular way of men who have worked with their hands through all 4 seasons for most of their adult lives. He was not tall. He had dark eyes and a quality of stillness that people sometimes mistook for slowness until they watched him work, at which point they generally stopped talking and just watched. He had a way of moving around a broken piece of equipment that was less like an inspection and more like a conversation, circling, pausing, returning to a particular point, listening in a way that seemed to go beyond what could actually be heard. He didn't talk much at the shop beyond what the job required. He had a whiteboard on the wall where he wrote the day's jobs in his small, precise handwriting. He made coffee in a French press at 7 in the morning and drank it black while reviewing the list. He did not have a website. He had a sign on the garage door that said Beaumont and Daughter, Appliance Repair, in stenciled black letters and a phone number below it. And that had been sufficient for 11 years. On the workbench along the back wall, between the oscilloscope and the parts cabinet, there was a framed photograph. It showed a younger Leonard in a hard hat and an Intertech Systems polo shirt, standing with a group of 8 engineers in front of a large industrial installation. The installation was a prototype thermal management system that Intertech had been developing for commercial kitchen applications. The occasion was a commissioning ceremony. Leonard was standing slightly apart from the group, as though he had been asked to move closer for the photo, and had complied only partially. On the back of the frame, in handwriting that was not his, someone had written, "Lead Systems Engineer, Intertech Thermal, 2009. First successful commission. We wouldn't have gotten there without you." The frame had been turned backward to the wall for the better part of 3 years and had not been turned forward again. Ren had seen it turned backward. She had not asked about it. She was 12 years old and understood, in the manner of children who pay careful attention to the people they love, that some things were not yet ready to be questions. Hargrove Restaurant occupied the ground floor of a restored heritage building on the corner of Wellington and Grant, in the part of the city where the sidewalks were clean and the restaurant names were printed in small fonts and the menus did not list prices on the version handed to certain guests. It was the kind of establishment that did not advertise because it did not need to, and it had held its reputation for 11 years on the basis of food that was genuinely exceptional and service that knew how to be invisible. The executive chef, A man named Paul Darcy had cooked there for 7 of those 11 years and had a way of running his kitchen that the staff respected even when they found it difficult, which was frequently. The gala on Saturday was the largest private event Hargrove had hosted in 4 years. 200 guests. A menu that Paul Darcy had been developing for 6 months. A guest list that included a retired senator, a nationally recognized food journalist, and, most relevantly, the committee chair of the Canadian Culinary Foundation, whose annual recognition award was something the restaurant group had been quietly positioning toward for the better part of 2 years. The kind of event that takes a long time to build and a very short time to lose. The oven system had stopped working at 4 in the afternoon, during service prep. Not a single unit, all 12. The building's chief engineer had been called immediately. He had identified the problem within the hour as a firmware failure in the central control module. Not a mechanical issue, not an electrical issue, but a failure in the proprietary software system that the Belgian firm had installed and which could not, according to the documentation, be accessed or repaired by anyone without a current service license from the manufacturer. The manufacturer was in Ghent. It was 11 o'clock at night in Ghent. The emergency service line had been reached, assessed, and had informed Sylvia Chen that the earliest a licensed technician could be on site was Monday morning. This information had been delivered without particular sympathy, in the manner of people whose job descriptions do not include the word urgency. 3 independent technicians had been called. The first had arrived, looked at the system architecture, and said he wasn't licensed for that proprietary platform and couldn't touch it without voiding the warranty. The second had said the same thing, but more apologetically. The third had attempted to access the control module with a bypass tool he carried for emergencies, had triggered a secondary lockout protocol, and it left Sylvia with a system that was now additionally locked and a look on his face that told her everything she needed to know before he said it. By 9 o'clock, Paul Darcy was standing in his kitchen with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, looking at 12 cold ovens and not saying anything. The kitchen staff moved around him with a particular quiet of people trying very hard not to be present in the same way they were. The gala was in 36 hours. There was nothing in the building that could replace what was missing. Sylvia had called her contact of the restaurant group's facilities network, who had called someone who knew someone in the commercial kitchen equipment sector, who had eventually said a name. It was the name on the whiteboard in a converted garage on the west side of the city. She had made the call herself, standing in the corridor outside the kitchen, her voice carrying the flatness of someone who has been managing catastrophe for 5 hours and has run out of register. Leonard Beaumont had listened without interrupting. When she finished, he had asked 2 questions. The first, what brand and model is the control module? The second, has anyone attempted a hardware bypass in the last 2 hours? She had answered both questions. There was a pause. I can come and look at it, he said. I'm not making any promises. He had asked Sylvia to text him the technical documentation she had on file and told her he would be there in 40 minutes. He had looked at the clock on the wall, looked at Wren, who was at the workbench doing her history homework with her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, and said, "Get your bag. We're going out." Wren had closed her textbook with the bookmark in the right place and picked up her backpack without a word, because she had been doing this since she was 8 years old and she understood what it meant when her father looked at the clock and made that particular assessment. The oven bank ran the full length of the east wall of the kitchen, 12 units, floor to ceiling, integrated into the building's ventilation and gas infrastructure, in a way that made the Belgian firm's installation look like a permanent architectural feature rather than removable equipment. Leonard walked the length of it once without touching anything. Then again, more slowly. He crouched at the far end, where the control module was housed in a recessed panel, and looked at the indicator lights for a long time. Wren found a corner stool near the pastry prep station and opened her history textbook again. One of the sous chefs, a young man named no one had introduced to her, brought her a glass of water without being asked. She thanked him without looking up from the page. Paul Darcy was still in the kitchen. He had put his jacket back on, which meant something different than when he had taken it off. He stood at the pass and watched Leonard without approaching. The senior events coordinator at Hargrove was a man named Victor Strand. He was 51 years old and had been at the restaurant for 9 years, which was longer than anyone currently working there, including Paul Darcy, and he carried this fact with a low-frequency authority that he did not often need to deploy because the authority was generally understood without deployment. He had been in a planning meeting on the 2nd floor when the ovens went down, and had come to the kitchen at 6 and assessed the situation and gone back to the meeting at 7 because there was nothing he could usefully do, and he had the particular practicality of people who know precisely what they are useful for. He came back to the kitchen at 10:15 and saw Leonard Beaumont crouched at the control module with a diagnostic tablet and Ren Beaumont on a stool in the corner reading what appeared to be a history textbook. He looked at them both for a moment with an expression that cycled through several things before settling on something not quite contempt, but adjacent to it. "Who authorized this person to access the control system?" he said. He said it to the room generally, but his eyes were on Sylvia, who was standing near the coffee station with a clipboard. "I did," Sylvia said. "He's not a licensed technician for this platform," Victor said, still at the same register, which was the register of a man correcting something obvious for the benefit of people who should have known better. "Anything he does in there puts us in breach of the service agreement, and if he makes it worse, we are liable for the full replacement cost of a system that costs more than the average home in this city." He paused, and then he looked at Ren on the stool, and then at the canvas tool bag on the prep counter, and then back at Leonard's back. "And this is not a supervised work site. There are open flames and food safety protocols, and that child should not be in a commercial kitchen after hours." The kitchen went quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when something has been said that nobody is quite willing to respond to. Ren lowered her book slightly. She did not say anything. She looked at her father's back, and then she straightened her reading glasses and looked back at the page. Leonard did not turn around. He finished what he was looking at on the diagnostic tablet, made a note on a small pad he kept in his jacket pocket, and then he stood up and turned around slowly and looked at Victor Strand. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds. It was not angry. It was the look of someone who has fully understood what has just been said and is deciding whether it merits a response, and has decided it does not. Not out of submission. Out of a kind of economy that is harder to answer than anger would have been. He looked at Sylvia, the third technician who came in. "Did he use a bypass tool on the module before the lockout?" Sylvia said yes. "Which port?" She showed him the notation on her clipboard. Leonard nodded once. He looked at Ren. She had already put the textbook in her bag and was zipping it closed, because she had recognized something in her father's posture that told her the conversation was over and the work was about to change. She set the bag neatly under the stool and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Leonard turned back to the control module. Victor Strand stood for another moment and then left the kitchen. His footsteps on the corridor floor were audible for longer than was comfortable. Paul Darcy moved from the past to the center of the kitchen. He didn't say anything. He stood where he could see what Leonard was doing, with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who has run out of options and knows what that means. It was just after 11:30 when Sylvia walked to the corner where Ren was sitting and crouched down to her level. Ren looked up from the table she had been studying at, a multiplication table she had pulled from her workbook and was going through with a pencil, checking off the rows she had memorized. Sylvia said, "Can I get you anything?" "Something to eat?" Ren said, "I'm okay, thank you. Is there anything I can help with?" Sylvia looked at her for a moment. The girl was 12 years old and sitting in a commercial kitchen after midnight with her library book and her multiplication table and her reading glasses that were slightly too large for her face, and she was asking if there was anything she could help with. She said no, and she meant it kindly, and Ren nodded and went back to her multiplication table. The problem, when Leonard found it at 12:47 in the morning, was not in the control module itself. It was upstream of it. The bypass tool the third technician had used had not triggered a lockout in the software. It had triggered a thermal relay failsafe in the physical infrastructure, a component that the Belgian firm had installed as a redundancy against electrical surge and which was not referenced anywhere in the standard documentation. It was referenced in a secondary technical appendix that had been distributed only to the original installation team and had not been filed with the building's maintenance records. Leonard knew it existed because he had been part of the team that had contributed to the early specification of that exact fail-safe standard at Enertech Systems in 2009, before the protocol had been adapted by 3 subsequent manufacturers and buried in appendices that almost no one read anymore. He said without turning around, "The lockout is physical, not digital. There's a thermal relay behind the secondary housing that's been tripped. It's a manual reset. Nobody looked for it because the documentation doesn't tell you it's there." Sylvia said, "Can you reset it?" Leonard said, "Yes." He said it with no particular emphasis as a statement of fact, He reached for the appropriate tool, and he reset it. It took 11 minutes. At 1:14 in the morning, Leonard straightened up, wiped his hands on a cloth, and said, "Try Unit 1." Paul Darcy was at the oven before anyone else could move. He turned the dial. The ignition clicked. The burner element lit. The digital display blinked on and settled at its starting temperature, steady and even and unhesitating. The way things look when they are working exactly as they are supposed to work. Darcy put both hands flat on the top of the oven and looked at the display for a moment. Then he stepped back and looked at the bank of 12 units and said quietly, "Run them all." They ran them all. 12 for 12, the kitchen filled with the low sound of systems coming back to life, the click and settle of 12 sets of burners, the quiet hum of 12 ventilation fans, the warmth moving out from the east wall in a slow, even wave that was not dramatic and was, because of that, exactly right. Sylvia stood near the door with her clipboard against her chest and looked at the oven bank with an expression that had nothing professional in it. Wren had put away her multiplication table. She was watching her father put his tools back in the canvas bag, one by one, in the order they had come out, which was the order they always went back. She watched the way she always watched him work, with the quiet attentiveness of someone who is learning without being taught. Leonard had the bag over his shoulder and was at the door before Paul Darcy came around the pass. "Wait," Paul said. Leonard waited. Paul stood in front of him. He was the kind of man who did not often have difficulty with words, and he was having difficulty now. He said, "What you just did. I don't have a framework for that. I want you to know that I understand the difference between someone who fixed a problem and someone who knew something nobody else in this city knew." Leonard said, "You have a good kitchen." Your staff stayed calm. It was an odd thing to say, and it was exactly what he meant, and he turned and walked out. Sylvia caught up with him in the corridor outside the loading bay door. Leonard was settling the bag more evenly on his shoulder. Wren was one step behind him, her backpack on, her library book under her arm. "The invoice," Sylvia said. "Send it to operations, whatever your standard rate is." Leonard said he would. Sylvia paused. She said, "Victor Strand was out of line tonight. That's not how we operate here, and I should have said so at the time." Leonard looked at her. He didn't fill the pause. He let it be what it was. "I know," he said. And then he walked out into the night with his daughter beside him. Wren waited until they were in the truck, seatbelts on, the engine running with its usual reluctant cough, before she said anything. She had her library book in her lap and her reading glasses folded in her hand, and she looked out the windshield at the service lane behind the building. "That man who said I wasn't supposed to be there," she said. "Victor," Leonard said. "Was he wrong?" Leonard checked the mirror and pulled out of the lane. "About the rules, technically, no. Wren considered this, but you stayed anyway. The job wasn't finished." She turned the library book over in her hands. "Did it bother you?" "What he said?" Leonard drove for a moment before answering. The city at 2 in the morning was a different city. Emptier, more honest about its shapes. What he said about the work bothered me less than what he said about you being there. He paused. "You weren't doing anything wrong." Wren put her reading glasses in the front pocket of her backpack where she always kept them. "I know," she said. Not defensively, as a statement of fact, the same way her father made statements of fact. He recognized it, and felt something about that recognition that he didn't have a word for but didn't need one. At 3 in the morning in the kitchen at Hargrove, Paul Darcy was running the prep work he would have run the following morning. The ovens held their temperature evenly across all 12 units. The kitchen had its sound back, the low, warm hum of a space that is doing what it was built to do. 2 of his line cooks were running sauces. 1 was managing a braise that needed the overnight hours. Paul Darcy stood at the pass and looked at his kitchen and felt something that chefs who have been cooking seriously for long enough will recognize but rarely say out loud, which is that a kitchen running well at 3 in the morning, when no one is watching and there is no audience and the work is purely the work, is as close to something worth doing as most days ever offer. He thought about the man in the canvas jacket, the way he had stood in front of those 12 cold ovens and said nothing and looked at them the way you look at something you already partially understand and are working toward understanding fully. The way the girl had sat on the stool with her multiplication table and not complained, not asked to leave, not looked at her phone. The canvas bag, worn at the handles, packed like every tool had a home. It always returned to. He found Sylvia's number in his phone and sent her a message. It said, "Find out what he charged and double it. If he says no, double it again." The invoice arrived by email the following morning before 8, while Leonard was still at the workbench running a diagnostic on a domestic refrigerator with an intermittent compressor issue. The amount was modest. It was the amount of a man who knew what the work was worth and did not price it against what the situation had been worth to someone else. Sylvia looked at the number, looked at Paul Darcy's message from the night before, and did the arithmetic twice to make sure she had it right. Then she processed the transfer. Leonard was halfway through the compressor diagnostic when the notification appeared on his phone. He looked at the number. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put the phone down and went back to the compressor. Wren came in at 3:30 from school and dropped her backpack by the door and sat on her stool with a cushion she had sewn herself and took out her history textbook. Leonard was finishing the compressor job. The radio on the shelf was playing something he had set it to in the morning and not changed. After a while, Wren said, without looking up from her homework, "Dad." "Mm-mm. Did they pay you?" "They did." She turned a page. "More than you asked." He looked at her. She turned a page. "More than you asked." He looked at her. She was reading, not looking at him. "How did you know that?" "Because that's what happens when you do something nobody else can do and you charge what you usually charge." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said things she had worked out on her own and simply considered settled. "You should charge more." Leonard said nothing for a moment. He put the last tool back in its place on the wall. "That's a conversation for another day." Wren accepted this with the patience of someone who knows the conversation will eventually be had. She went back to her homework. The following Saturday evening, the gala proceeded exactly as planned. 200 guests moved through Hargrove's main dining room in the kind of ambient warmth that well-run events produce when every component is doing its job quietly and without announcement. The food was what Paul Darcy had spent 6 months making it, which was to say it was exceptional in the specific way of things built from accumulated, unrepeatable attention. The committee chair of the Canadian Culinary Foundation had the pork belly with the preserved lemon and the charred leek reduction, and then had it again, which Paul Darcy's service staff clocked, and which Paul Darcy himself was told about and registered in the way he registered things that mattered, without external display. Victor Strand had been on administrative leave since Friday morning. This had been communicated to him by Sylvia Ching in a brief, factual conversation in the second-floor office, in a tone that contained no excess and required no elaboration because Victor Strand understood exactly what had occurred and what it had cost, and the calculation needed no walking through. Whether the leave would become something more permanent was a question that was still formally open and practically closed. On Wednesday morning, Leonard was at the workbench when a car he didn't recognize pulled up outside the garage. The man who got out was 60-something, in a jacket that cost what Leonard's tools were worth, and he walked to the garage door with the unhurried assurance of someone accustomed to covering ground efficiently. His name was Martin Quaid. He was a partner in the facilities group that managed 12 commercial properties in the city, which included Hargrove, and he had been in the restaurant on Saturday night and had eaten the pork belly and had heard from Paul Darcy what had happened on Thursday. He had sat with that information for 4 days before he drove across the city on a Wednesday morning to a converted garage where the sign said Beaumont and Daughter in stenciled black letters. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the bench, the tool wall, the whiteboard with the day's jobs written in small, precise handwriting. Leonard looked up. Martin said, "You're Beaumont." "Yes." Martin stepped inside far enough to see the photograph on the workbench, the one that had been turned to face the wall for 3 years. It was facing forward now, as of this morning. For no reason Leonard had fully articulated to himself, except that it had seemed, sometime in the previous 48 hours, like the right direction for it to face. Martin looked at the photograph for a moment, recognized the installation, recognized the logo on the polo shirt, did the arithmetic quickly and quietly in his way. He looked at Leonard. "I have 11 other buildings," Martin said. "Every one of them has equipment that the standard service industry cannot adequately maintain for exactly the reasons you understand, and they don't." He paused. "I'm not here to make you an offer today. I'm here because I think you should know that the work you did Thursday night is the kind of work that doesn't stay in one place." Leonard set down the tool he had been holding. He said, "What does that mean, practically speaking?" "It means when you're ready. For something bigger than this, if you ever want that. There are people who would rather have you than the alternative. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a card. He placed it on the edge of the workbench. No urgency. I know you have work to finish. He said this looking at the whiteboard. Then he nodded once and walked back out to his car. Leonard looked at the card. He looked at the photograph that was now facing forward. He looked at the days list on the whiteboard. 4 jobs, all of them ordinary, all of them solvable, all of them waiting. He picked the tool back up and went back to work. When Rin came in at 3:30, she put her bag down and looked at the photograph that had been turned back around and didn't say anything about it because she had her father's instinct for which things needed to be said and which ones were simply true. She climbed onto her stool and took out her homework and opened her textbook to the right page. After a while, not looking up, she said, "Something happened today." It wasn't a question. "Someone came by," Leonard said. "About work?" "About work that hasn't started yet." Ren absorbed this the way she absorbed most things, fully and without drama. She picked up her pencil. Outside the garage, a light, late afternoon rain had started. The quiet Canadian kind that arrives without announcement and makes the pavement dark and even, and fills the air with the smell of something clean being put back in its place. "Are you going to do it?" she asked. Leonard looked at the card on the edge of the workbench. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at his daughter, who was already reading. Her pencil moving, her glasses slightly crooked, entirely present. "I don't know yet," he said. "You're still in school." Ren looked up at him over the top of her glasses with an expression that was entirely her mother's and which he would never in his life stop recognizing. "That's not really an answer," she said. "It's the true one," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, the way she held things she intended to return to, and then she went back to her homework. The rain came down on the roof of the garage with a sound that was ordinary and familiar and entirely sufficient. The tool wall was organized the way it had always been. The whiteboard had 4 jobs on it. The photograph on the bench faced forward. The card sat at the edge of the workspace, small and still, waiting for nothing in particular, going nowhere. Leonard Beaumont picked up his tool and went back to the work in front of him, which was the work he had, which had always been enough, and which he understood, for the first time in a long time, did not have to be all there was.